Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Cyber PMM Podcast, the only show dedicated to helping cyber PMMs fight digital chaos, cut through the hype, and do more with less. Let's dive in. Hi everyone, thanks for joining this podcast. I'm really excited today to have an old colleague and friend here with me, Jessvin Thomas. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Dane. Excited to be doing this.
Awesome. No, it's so good to have. I've been looking forward to this. I haven't actually had an interview in a couple months, and so I'm glad we were able to find some time to connect and go over not only your career path in cyber, which has been very fascinating to watch and be a part of, but also your background, how you got into it, and all that good stuff. So excited to learn more about you here.
Cool.
So why don't we get started? First of all, so that I don't butcher your introduction, do you want to give an overview of who you are? And we can start there.
Sure. I ask that question myself all the time. Who am I? Why am I doing this thing? So I'm Jessvin Thomas. I've been in cyber. You and I worked together when we were in our Optiv days. And I've ended up spending a career in security operations for probably at least 20 something years that I never really planned on. I didn't go to school for any of it or any of that stuff. It just happened. But it's been a really fun ride. I've done everything from running internal teams, investing in companies. I actually have a coffee shop that I run, just different things. It's been fun to do a whole lot of different projects and activities. But yeah, I started my career graduating from school and just needing a job during the dot-com boom. And back then, I don't even think it was not cybersecurity for sure. I think it was information assurance. And so it's just been interesting to see the industry grow too, and to be a real career that didn't even exist back then.
So .com, that's early 2000s-ish?
Yeah, I graduated in like 2000, I think 2001. Yeah, I graduated in 2001.
That must have been a crazy time. And then you went into your career at that time so that you were exposed to IT at the outset?
I got into computers at an early age in the nerdiest way possible. I didn't even have a computer, and I had heard about programming somehow, and I still remember checked a book out of the library on basic programming, and I wrote a program on a piece of paper. What's the point? Wow. There was nothing to run it. I just distinctly remember doing something like that. I have no idea what it did or what it was about, and it couldn't have been very long or very good, but I did that, and then I got into building computers and things like that, and I had a job in school. I went to school for math and operations research, but my job was just to make money on the side. I worked in a computer lab for IT support for one of the divisions. It was at the School of Agriculture. And so what was interesting with the School of Agriculture, it was this really tall tower, and it was floors 1 through 15 or something. And it was almost each level, you could tell how important the group was in terms of funding. So in agriculture, you have everything from somebody that's doing soil sampling and soil analysis. So I went to Cornell, and they have a big agricultural program to it. But you don't get a lot of grant money for that. So you're on floor 2 or 3. But what's also in the School of Agriculture that gets a ton of grant money is the School of Meteorology, studying weather. So they were literally floor with the best thing. And so what would happen is, I remember one year they got these new computers, these Dell Optiv computers. And I remember them being dropped off in these big boxes, and we had to unpack them and do all this stuff. And it was super cool. It was all this new expensive equipment. But 90% of my job was not that. 90% of my job was a professor that had a small amount of grant money, that had a tiny computer that was running some machine that picked up a sample and did something. Everything was really dusty. Nothing worked. And if something broke, he couldn't buy a new one. He'd have to cobble together some parts. So we had this big junkyard of just stuff, computer parts everywhere. And somebody would submit a ticket, and we'd go in and try to figure out how to make this thing work, finding chips or this or that, to just squeeze his budget. So that's how I got into computers to begin with. I remember even my chair in the lab was a computer. It was a bunch of XT computers stacked back when you had desks on top of each other. But I thought it was awesome. As a college student, I had my own office. It was just a big junk room, but still, it had a door and a window. So I'm like, wow, that's great.
Now, when you grew up, did you have exposure to computers? Were you the one that was taking them apart and putting them back together? Or how did you first get exposure to technology?
I remember my mom we had a work. She worked on mainframes, and she had to connect to main. We had an IBM XT computer with a 300 baud modem, and it was DOS something, but it had solitaire on it, and it had this Tron game. Oh, I remember it was EGA. There's VGA, which is 256 colors, and there was CGA, which was 4 colors. But in between was this little tiny version called EGA for enhanced graphic adapter, and it had 16 colors, and that was a big deal. So we had an EGA computer with 16 colors, and I could play this game Tron on it. And so I started getting into stuff like that, building things, and I think it's called A Game of Life. It was a really simple early program that was all about mutations and simulating how organisms grow. This sounds way more advanced than anything it actually was. It was a dot. And this dot, if it hit another dot, it'd make 2 dots. And if it hit another dot, it would hit 3 dots. But the combination of dots that it created was different, and the way it behaved, would it go straight up and then left, or then whatever's random? So then every time it merged, it picked a new random mutation. That was my first introduction to seeing computer as a really interesting functional laboratory, as opposed to the calculator.
Got it. Yeah, I remember playing Atari way back in the day. I don't know if what you're describing is before then.
I didn't have it. This was a computer. This was like a personal computer or something.
This was on it, yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't luck out in having Atari. I had a Nintendo. Computer-wise, it was I think the Atari was probably more powerful. Probably had more graphics.
So where did you grow up, by the way?
So I grew up in the Northeast. I was born in upstate New York in Albany. And then moved around to different places and ended up growing up in a town called Cheshire, Connecticut, which actually I found out later, it's got a number of random claims to fame. For example, if James Vanderbeek, he's like an actor for Creek and stuff or something like that. He went to my high school. Yeah. But for me, I found out years later, there's this really cool, famous professor called Edward Tufte on the visualization of data. And he actually lives in Cheshire. So I'm like, great, it's on the map.
Oh, look at that.
But that's where I grew up. It's like a kind of a smallish, suburban, typical kind of town. And most of my life was in the Northeast.
So you moved from that department experience, the agriculture department, sitting on desktop computers, and then graduate and enter the real world and start getting exposure to markets and cyber eventually. So how did that path look for you?
I graduated in a time when it was earlier days of submitting online resumes. And so what happened is everybody would submit their resume online, but it didn't have any proper queuing. So recruiters would pick all the same resumes. All the top 10 students were always the top 10 students. And I was definitely not one of them, not even close. Bottom 50% of the pack kind of thing. And so I'd never get selected through this automation selection process. But the system wasn't smart enough where it would literally double book people, because a recruiter would go, oh, I like that guy. Another recruiter would say, I like that guy too. And then they both booked the same person at the same time. And who knows, they probably already had a job. And of course, he was a student. He didn't care. So he didn't cancel anything. And then, so only on the day of did it get manually reconciled. And then you realize, this guy couldn't show up. And now a recruiter would have a spot in their interview schedule. And so what I ended up doing is realizing I'd go by the career office every day and look at the list to see where there's openings. And if there was any remotely thing related to anything I might know about, I just dropped it in my resume, because most of the recruiters didn't want to waste their time. So they just sit there for an hour, they talk to somebody. And this company I ended up talking to over lunch was a small cybersecurity company called Exalt, a tiny consulting company. And it was getting into security, and they were looking for people. And I didn't know anything about it. And my only question was them, it's like, all right, we're going to train you. We'll do whatever. If you it was firewall installs back then. That's all they needed. More people to install a firewall. So my only question was to understand, this is interesting. This is cool. So when you train me, do I get paid at the same time? And they're like, that's dumb. Yeah, you get paid, you get benefits, you get whatever. I'm like, oh, okay, great. Then I'll take it. But I was that was my thought process back then. And one of my earliest clients was a Nokia. And I had the good fortune and luck of working with that team, and they were working mostly overseas in Finland, and they were working on really large projects. And my original job was we were doing a firewall migration, and we just had to get the data it was a rule base. We had these different management stations, and we were moving to a single management station. And there was no way to combine the data from multiple management stations into one. So the idea was then somebody, some sucker, is going to go and manually read through every single line of a firewall rule base, find out what was in there, and type it into the new one. So source, destination, port, comments, rule by rule. And there are like 400 rules. It's not even you see the data right there. It's not a text file. You got to click in and click there and see this and do all kinds of stuff. But I'm like, oh, they have hired the wrong guy for this. My attention to detail is horrible. So there is no way I'm going to be able to type these things in. And so instead of course, typing things in, doing it the manual way, doing it the way I probably should have done, I spent 3 weeks to figure out if there was any way I could automate this process so that I wouldn't make any mistakes. And it turned out all the data was in text files. They were all in rule-based.fws. And there was this guy called Phone Boy that like had a lot of things around it. And so I wrote this Perl program to help me like merge data together and merge into a single rule-based, deploy it and test it and things like that. And I'm still not 100% sure that it fully worked. Like the company still works. So that was fine. But that was like my introduction into cybersecurity, and really that it was all just data in the end. It was all this data and putting it together and seeing it from different views. It all started from migrating a firewall.
Your path to where you are today, and we'll get there, but also the career progression, getting to automation, SOAR, just those very advanced areas, started with this understanding of basic logs, basic text files. Like you said, it's all data. Like at the end of the day, it's all data. And you were analyzing it down to the granular level from an early start. Do you think that gave you like a better appreciation of how security worked throughout your career?
Yeah, I guess that's probably true. I never really thought about it that way, honestly, that a lot of what I had been working on, I could have done a security analyst job or a pen testing job. So some of my other colleagues that I worked with went into those areas, and I worked in, it was SecOps to some degree. You were doing these firewall things to get alerts and all that stuff. But like you said, it was all essentially, I was working on just making the systems work and make. So back when today I talk to CISOs and they're like, I feel like I have more engineers in my group than I have security people. There's an onboarding engineer and a SIM engineer and a threat detection engineer, and it's all engineering. And back then it was, you thought of it just more purely information security, cybersecurity. So you're probably right that that aspect of data is probably in automation and all that kind of stuff started that early. I think the other thing is we ended up doing a lot of work around SecOps as well. So like ultimately connecting that to event logging and all those things. And we were doing it at a pretty large scale. Back then, Nokia was a pretty significant company as a mobile, like number one mobile phone manufacturer in the world. We had factories everywhere. We had offices all over the place. We had all kinds of different use cases and situations. And I remember installing this version of Net Forensics, which was the SIM we used at a time, it wasn't clunky, but it was way ahead of its time. But it was still, there was so much work you had to do to figure out. All you had was IDS data and firewall data. I don't even think we had Windows logs data or anything. We had antivirus. There was no EDR. There wasn't anything like that. How could you possibly figure out over a company of 80,000 people what was actually going on? And where was there a security breach or not a security breach? For sure, between that and getting these systems to work, I probably spent a lot of time in systems and system engineering as much as I did in cybersecurity.
Interesting. Yeah, I was watching also the Jensen Huang GTC keynote last week, and he had a huge partnership announcement. I think it was with Nokia. They're still, I don't know what exactly it all entailed, but I remember hearing that last week and wondering, oh, wow, I haven't heard Nokia in a while, but they must have a huge AI footprint and need right now because they're doing this deal with NVIDIA. It must be, pretty important right now.
4-year-old company that they start out in tires and things like that. And it's the Nokian River. And so it's got to reinventing itself constantly. Phones is just a step along the way. That's where they're up to now.
But so did you go to Optiv from Nokia or where?
No, so I kind of did a couple of different stints along the way. They weren't all cyber. So I was at Nokia. So I was in consulting and then I went to Nokia really I was a consultant first, and then I got hired directly into the company, did a bunch of projects there. And then I actually took a little hiatus from cyber for a while, or security. And I actually focused on, we were launching within Nokia at the time, we were getting into consumer internet services. So that's what it was called back then. Today, you'd think of it as like social media. So music, games, maps, these were the really early days of that. And Nokia's plan in general was, hey, we have this huge footprint of users on physical hardware distributed all across the globe. And we should be able to use this to deliver digital content. So app store, music store, all of those things. And so they built a bunch of those capabilities. And it just seemed like an exciting thing to be doing and place to be. So I actually moved to Boston And I got a job as part in the consumer internet services division and worked in an area called service platforms. And it was all about scale out infrastructure. So we had 5 to 10,000 computers distributed all across the globe. We were doing things like real-time single sign-on. People were logging into their phone over a cellular network, getting in. We're doing maps, real-time traffic, and all of this was, I don't remember, 2008. So those are early days for Google and Yahoo, and maybe not Yahoo, but and understanding internet at scale and what scale computing meant. And this is the early days of cloud too. This is around when AWS launched. And that was one of my first big projects, was actually to get into the cloud business, so to speak. And there was a lot of tension internally because you had, even today, there's tension on-prem versus cloud. This is back then in the early days. In cloud, back then there were no VPCs or anything. You put an EC2 instance out there and it was out on the internet. And everything was developer tooling, like 100%. So the idea of security figuring out what to do and infrastructure figuring out what to do, like the whole model was very different. And so I was lucky enough to be a part of that. There's a lot I learned there around even Puppet, system configuration management. How do you manage machines at scale? How do you get them to operate up and down? CI/CD, really in the early days, Jenkins and before days, when you're trying to figure out how to deploy machines, that things that would take you weeks and weeks of time to now get them up in an hour or something. An hour was incredible. So I did that for a while. And then I mentioned before, Jay went to another company, to Blackstone. And at Blackstone, he was involved in working on improving their security overall, improving IT and technology. They were doing a whole transformation. And that was in New York. And between all of this, I'd moved to Texas. I'd been in Boston. I just had kids. And so all of my in-laws, my mom lived in the New York, Connecticut area. So just for moving back, I joined up with Jay and worked at Blackstone for a while. And there we had this interesting scenario where our goal was to transform the firm's security. And that's because there was this recognition all of a sudden, this is 2010s, 2012, there's a recognition all of a sudden, thanks to, frankly, the Wall Street Journal, that what people used to think of as, we're a finance company. Like security is for technology companies. Like we're not a technology company, we're a finance company. So sure, do some stuff. But somewhere in that time frame, Steve Schwarzman actually himself came to realize that, wait a second, where the future of all this finance stuff is going in technology, because the future of everything is going into technology. And if the future of everything is going to technology, I need to think more like a technology company. They hired a former CTO of Capital IQ S&P, Bill Murphy. And Bill Murphy worked on going from thinking of this as internal IT to forward-facing technology. And as part of that, there's a whole security transformation too. And so Jay led that. And we had 3 goals. Was number 1, protect the firm. Number 2, help protect portfolio companies. So there's a variety of companies that Blackstone owns. And we started developing security that's helpful to these companies too, so we could protect the investments. And then number 3, invest in disruptive investments that would help the first 2. And through that, we actually kicked off something that still goes on today. In fact, I saw on LinkedIn, it was just 2 weeks ago, the Blackstone Security Conference. So the first one was whatever it was, over 10 years ago. Big shout out to Adam Atina. He was the one that he joined the team and kicked it off. And he's still running that there, of getting portfolios together, talking about security in general across these companies and giving pointers and ideas and building a collaborative community. And then also we were doing investments, and we invested in Carbon Black, actually. Mike Viscuso, who first built out Carbon Black in the really early days before it was known as anything. We had a couple of companies we looked at, and like I said, I did firewall migration, right? The world didn't need it. Checkpoint was doing fine. Fortinet was doing fine. But the idea of endpoint security didn't exist at all. Not the way we think of it today, at least. Antivirus was there, and we could see this being an issue. We could see that we had like managing directors in Australia that would travel to China, and we had no IT in Australia. And we'd have to tell them, hey, you got to wipe your machine and do this, do that to go to China. And it's, they don't want to wipe their machine. And B, even if they did, there's no IT to take it from them or to give it back to them. So you're going to be without your laptop for a week. So that's what led to the idea of pitching this idea of Carbon Black being the video camera or the video recorder of the computer of cyber. And he said, look, when you're protecting, I still remember his pitch. He's like, when you're protecting 7-Eleven, you don't build a million burglar alarms and everything. You do some of that, but you have a video camera and you're always recording what's happening. And that creates the ability to figure out what happened, prevent things in the future. And we need to build a video camera like that for a computer, for a laptop. And we actually invested in that and built it out. And it eventually got sold at Bit9, and Bit9 changed its name to Carbon Black. And there it is today. Same thing with Cylance. It was a whole new way of looking at of antivirus, a mathematical operation. So our idea was things we could invest in that we knew had value, but actually other people weren't doing. So as operators, we could do that. And that led to, we had the problem of MSSP. We were still a small group within Blackstone, even though they had a lot of money and we had all these portfolio companies. And so the idea of managing security operations, we couldn't afford what we afforded at Nokia. So we needed to outsource it. But we weren't super happy with what we didn't feel we were super happy with what was available. So we planned to make an investment in Kivant, which had an MSSP, and we knew them really well. And it was an early stage MSSP. And our plan was to invest in that and help build MSSP. And what ended up happening is we became successful enough overall that one of the partners there, Dave Johnson, said, why don't you just buy the company? And we didn't even know that was an option. And so we ended up investing in Accuvant overall and then investing in Fishnet, putting it together to Optiv. And I joined to help, again, because the original trajectory was we're just going to focus on MSSP. So I joined to lead the MSSP part, even though the bigger Optiv thing was going on. And that's how you and I eventually met.
Yeah, that's right. I joined at that same time to help, bring the MSSP business to market. And yeah, you were there front and center, leading the ship really for all things MSS, which was a major key focus area. But plan, build, run, remember? It was very simple. That was a lesson in building a vision and strategy that the whole company could just say, oh yeah, I get it, right?
Yep.
It was like, all right, we're going to have these services, you help you plan, have services help you build, and then we're going to run it for you too, right? So many memories you just triggered for me talking about Carbon Black. I think that was my boss at the time, Russell Worth, who you remember, I'm sure. Yeah, he was in Boston for Carbon Black, my second day on the job. And I drove up because I was living in New Jersey, and the meeting was at Carbon Black's HQ in Waltham. And I'll never forget the atmosphere because it was humming. I mean, this was a company that went from, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's just say $10 to $100
Right.
within 6 to 12 months. And it was, I think I walked in the doors right when that was happening, and people were walking around. It was like, this campaign, this coming to partnerships. We had a partner meeting over here. The VP of sales from Optiv was meeting with the CEO over here. Russell was walking around showcasing Showpad, trying to get everybody.
Yeah, I remember Showpad.
I was like, whoa, this is on fire. You remember Carbon Black? The heyday was fascinating to watch, and Optiv played a huge role in that growth, right? I mean, it was synergistic. Optiv grew and Carbon Black grew, and along with a lot of other vendors. So yeah, it's so cool to know that you were, instrumental in connecting a lot of those dots between those two, between, Blackstone, Carbon Black, Optiv, Accuvant, and Fishnet. All of that came together. It was a complex kind of first couple years doing the MSS business, wasn't it?
It was definitely, I learned a lot in that. And I think one thing that was interesting to see is the difference between cybersecurity consulting and services versus what you have to do in a managed service. And in a consulting, you can build as you go. You've got a really smart person and they're like, all right, we can sell this service. We're going to do a pen test. And then I'm going to deliver the pen test and make some money. And then if I made some money, I can hire another guy for another pen test to do it. But something like MSS is a lot more like building a software company, at least back in the day, where you needed to invest up front. You had to have everything working up front. And that was an interesting challenge as we also brought together Fishnet and Accuvant. I have a lot of bigger appreciation now for when investors say they look for really simple business models, because MSS is definitely a really complicated thing. And it's just been interesting to see to this day. I definitely learned a lot about it. And I think even today, people are still trying to figure it out.
Well, yeah, I remember we had this lineup of services. It was called Vantage SIM. There was a lineup of 5 or 6 core services, but they all depended on really strong partnerships with those technology companies. And you had to have the people in the SOC. And that to me seemed like the hardest part was you had to have people that understood how to operate, McAfee or Splunk or whatever else in the SOC and know how to pull all those knobs for those technologies. And those are not cheap resources either. You have to really invest in the people element to make it work for managed services. And that's where later concept, which was automation based, because it brought more scalability to those processes.
Yeah, exactly. The big thing we learned about it was also the maturity varied. So from a customer perspective, You couldn't outpace their maturity. You had to align to where their maturity was. And for some customers, they needed to get some basic outcomes. And handing them some big complicated solution, even if they thought that was the right thing, it doesn't always necessarily get you to the right result. And so we built the idea of the next generation SOC of kind of the next level for very sophisticated customers that had complex environments to be able to use the latest technology and customize their outcomes. And I remember back then talking about data lakes early on. And back then we thought we had a data lake, and it was not what I would consider today like a data lake. But even we started to use things like Elastic, and we started to use Phantom Cyber before it was called SOAR as an automation platform. And the idea of this, the big idea to me was this continuous improvement cycle where we would build things with engineering, create detections out of that, use data science to figure out how well it's working or not, and get that feedback from the SOC, and feed those insights back in. That cycle of everybody being in one room, sorting that problem out, I think was more of even the core insight as I look back at it today than all the technology itself. It's a data science process. And that's where I see cybersecurity is getting closer and closer to what data science actually is, which is taking in data, having a hypothesis or a model, applying it, seeing the results, and then improving the model. And I think the more we can automate in the basics, the easier it is to get to that core kind of cycle or loop.
Yeah. I think I also learned a lot there appreciated how hard it is to take a new business and get into the established player category with analyst firms and with buyers. And yeah, we're a serious services player. I distinctly remember SecureWorks was this massive MSSP, and they were the leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant, and we were new kids on the block in a sense. And it was fun, but it doesn't happen overnight. And it only, even in the limited time I was there, it still took repetition and consistency and proving out and showing that you're delivering. That's one thing I remember about when I was there working with you, and you had your office there, and I think it was the 16th floor and that tower, that
In the
Denver
Chase building, right?
Building.
I don't know if
The
it's
Chase building.
More, but
yeah, they moved. If you ever go to Denver, they have like that.
Yeah,
huge,
that was the big one.
the tallest building.
Yep.
And I'm always like, if I'm ever with somebody, I'm like, oh, I used to work there, right? Because it's the biggest logo.
Right.
You know, it's kind of funny, and they're like Optiv. No, nobody ever really knows who they are, but unless they work in like cyber. But anyway, so I remember going into your office. We were working on it was coming up to Black Hat, and we had to put together a message and enter into this. We called it NextGen SecOps, and it was all about Phantom Cyber and the integration and how we're improving our services and using automation and SOAR. And SOAR was still relatively new at that time, but I remember just sitting there and you were at your whiteboard, and we started the conversation with like one dot on the board, and we ended, it was like, looked like one of those like mathematical, kind of like algorithmic. It was like, there was all this, and I was like, oh, okay. Wow, that's a lot, you made it make sense. And I was able to then take what made sense to bring it to our materials. We built a video. It was just a really cool experience. And that was probably one of the highlights for me at Optiv. It's fun to learn new things and then introduce new technologies to market. So maybe that's a good segue though, because today you're doing something similarly exciting, right? We're all faced with AI, and we're all in the market. We're all bringing products to market that are now either have to have AI capabilities or defend against AI attacks and things. So it's the new game. It's the new market picture is here, and you're smack dab in the middle of it back to your roots with data and analytics and tying together all these roots across everything you just described. But it just made me think, I wonder what your whiteboard looks like now, right? And so why don't you take us through like what you're up to? Because I know it's pretty exciting for you right now.
Yeah, I've gotten really lucky to get introduced to a company. It's called Auguria, and it's founded by Chris Coulter and Keith Palumbo, both people from Cylance, actually some ex-Cylance guys. And they started building this idea with Sin Ventures with Jay Leak. They invested in a couple years ago, and I've got the opportunity to work with them recently to help them grow it out to be a full-fledged business. And what's cool about it is, first of all, they've really focused on looking at the overall data picture. And the overall data picture, like 99% of the data is not the data that you need. It is usually 1% of the data that really matters to you. The hard part is finding that 1%. And for a long time, Security and technology in general has had one way to do it, which I'm going to call it a deterministic method right now, which is, and for those who are, I call it like, it's really, if you think of SIM, so this is looking at data overall, SIM is the closest we've had to looking at data. I look at that as the industrialization of Perl, where you did regular expressions, you look for some piece of text. If this piece of text is there, then I think this is alert. So you're looking through all the data and you're looking for pieces of text. That piece of text might be an IP address, that piece of text might be a user, a piece of text might be something. But it's all pieces of text. It's not actually meaning. So if you're looking, for example, an unusual login that might come from China, if it says like CN equals China and you look for that, you'll find it. But if it says Beijing, it's not going to find it, right? So what AI creates is the ability to say, semantically understand data. Understand, like when you're looking for something, I'm looking for something that's suspicious. What does suspicious mean? What is the context of suspicious? Or maybe even things you don't know. Tell me the interesting things that happened. What's interesting and what happened overall? Those are the kinds of things that AI can do. But the challenge, and you can do that, you can see that every day today with ChatGPT. You take an email you want to send, you paste it in, and you say, I want to make this sound better. How would you do that with automation? You can't do that with automation. You'd have to tell it lowercase this, uppercase that, right? But here it's, built enough context to know this is what would sound interesting, or this looks like you're emailing a customer. Here's how to make it more succinct to the customer. So AI takes that context and figures it out. Well, the challenge in logs is you could do that for 1 log at a time or 2 logs at a time. Go ahead and paste it in, but you can't do it for 1 billion. Not only is the context window too large, the cost is too high. You'd be sending all this stuff in all the time. So what we've managed to do is figure out with this patented approach that help us figure out how to reduce the data to its representative set. And to me, that's really fascinating. The idea that you have 1 billion events, but there's actually only 10,000 things that are actually happening. So if you think about, you might have your computer and every second it's checking something. Is the software up to date? Is the software up to date? Is the cloud there? Is the internet there? And there's millions and millions of things the computer is doing. But if you think about it from a human perspective, you're really just saying, I'm writing an email. So even though there's 1 million events that have to occur to do that. And so that's what we've managed to do, is to boil down the billions of signals into the groups of what's actually happening. And once we've done that, makes it small enough that AI can understand it, or AI can consume it, let's put it that way. And then you can start to ask questions like that. You'll say, show me all the things that logins from suspicious countries. And because it doesn't have to look through 1 billion IP addresses, it's just looking at the is this login, this login? Yeah, it might have said login like 100 times, but it knows it's a login. It now can see, oh wait, this is Beijing, or this is Shanghai, or this is Hong Kong. That context matters. And I think that gives a whole different way of looking at security that's very different than what's been done so far. And that's to me what makes it fascinating. It's like not just a thing, but it's the idea of a knowledge layer that you can create.
It made me think of basic organizing, like cleaning and organizing massive volumes of anything into categories or piles or whatever you want to do, talk about, and whatever you're up to, you have to start somewhere if you have a big mess in front of you. That's what you're doing, just with all this security data that analysts have to triage through.
That's actually a great example. You know what that reminds me of is several years ago, I mean, it was like probably 8 years ago or something, I tried Inbox Zero. The whole idea, and like back in the day when you had emails and you put them into folders and things like that, you try to get your inbox there. That was brutal, right? But to your point, that's what I was trying to figure out. Was like, okay, data was related to contracts. This thing is related to that. And then a lot of times I want to look at my email, and if I didn't know the exact word, I just had an idea. I did this pamphlet with Dane back in the day about SOC. What is it? Where is it? If I didn't get the exact words right, it would not find the email, right? But if you semantically load it, you could actually do that and figure out, okay, what's the common? Well, it was when I was working at Optiv. I was with this guy, Dane, and it had to do with a marketing document. And it could start figuring that out semantically. And like you said, from an email box, imagine if your email box was filled with 1 billion of emails you're getting in every day. In reality, that's what's happening with log telemetry. You're getting millions and millions of these events. But it turns out most of these events are just similar in nature. So if you can put them into these categories, into these folders, it's then easier for AI to go figure out, where might this be? What might this be? How do I sort this out? How do I figure out where to go? And that just unlocks a ton of other analytical outcomes you can get. The first one we're chasing is really cost savings. Maybe there's a bunch of email that's a bunch of junk email. And that's an analogy I used with somebody recently with physical mail, like physical mailboxes. If I wanted to tell you what does junk mail look like, again, I probably get 1% of my mail is probably valid or something like that, physical mail. And yet somehow I know when I look at the mail, what's junk and what's not. I don't know how to describe it. I don't read it. I just know, oh, this is a big pamphlet. This is a thing, junk pile, junk pile, junk pile. This looks valid. Let me put it into my pile. Let me put it into the thing I need to review. And so that's the first use case we're doing. And we see the same thing in a lot of security companies that, are just general companies for security, that most of their data is just stuff they don't need for security. And it's costing them a lot of money and it's requiring a lot of work. And so we can help them optimize and say, yeah, store this for compliance, no problem. But here's the data you should focus on for security. That's our initial use case and approach, but it's all built on this knowledge layer.
Is there a storage element to this as well where my phone I keep getting these alerts today, man, your storage is full. So now I got to figure out what videos I have to delete, blah, blah, blah. And I have my cloud service that I can store things, but it's, and that's why I'm wondering, and this is a data problem for me, say it's photos or videos, and if we can relate it to the SOC and if I want to go find that video, I don't want to just throw it out, right? I still want it accessible and ready for when I want to find that video, but I don't need it on my phone, right?
Yes.
Is that kind of something?
Yeah, it's a good analogy. So it's like, from our perspective, if you look at security operations, it's made up of a couple of different things. One is you get data in. Two is you put it somewhere. You figure out how to analyze it. And four is, in the case of security, you're detecting it for outcomes. In the case of photos, it might suggest to you, here's a photo you might be interested in. And so storage, actually, I'd say there is what would I call it? Storage is advanced actually a lot. So when you think of S3 blob storage, and storage actually has gotten pretty cheap. But the problem is you can't store it and make it accessible for analytics. That's the hard part. So we offer a storage layer, or if you want to use your own storage, so we built it off of Amazon S3 and a data lakehouse concept. And we can even plug into other lakehouses, right? And I do see that's the future of where things are going. Everything is going to go to this lakehouse manner. But the hard part's been the processing. So if you imagine you store all your photos in a lake, you can probably store them all. But like you said, how do I know which are the ones I want to have on my phone? Most of the time, it's been time. Oh, the ones that have been the most recent, I'll keep that on the phone. The ones that I won't put on the phone. And the further I scroll down, it'll load. But what if there's so much that even what you have in the last month is not what you want? And maybe there's a photo from your wedding that you just love. And just because it was however long ago it was, that doesn't mean that it's less important to you right now. And so that's the idea of semantic meaning. Can we organize this by meaning instead of just time? Can we say, these are all the things that are really important to me because I know I have this context of what's important to me. And that's the stuff I'm going to store and make accessible right away and be able to look for it as quickly as possible. And I'll store the other stuff on slightly slower storage. Or even if I just need to know generally. I think of this, another example is we talk about people who have to do 7 years of storage or some other compliance storage in security operations, or even not just in security, just general compliance. And a company like Iron Mountain, right? Or tape backup. Imagine that where you're like, get it stored for 7 years, no problem. It's an Iron Mountain, it's in tape backup, no problem. They're like, okay, great. But guess what? There's a court case. We want to, please pull the data about this court case. The only thing you have is time. You're like, when is this? Otherwise, you're pulling every tape to pull every piece of data. And you may not even have stored, you might not even have that court case. You have no idea. So we build this knowledge map that tells you where the data is. And then you can store data at different levels of storage and at different cost levels. And you're operating on the knowledge level to get more information. And then when you need to query the data, you can query the data. And so in our world with our data lake, it might take 30 seconds to pull the data. But that's only when you need the raw data. Most of the time, you're just good with, hey, this bad thing happened or this set of events happened. I don't need to see every individual event. I just need to know in general that it occurred. So that's the storage piece for us. And I think you're going to see this even in consumer electronics too, is it's automatically analyzing images. It's going to start optimizing where to store things, whether it's on your phone or whether it's in the cloud or whatnot. And it's going to charge you. It's going to instead ask you like, not that you're full. It's going to say, hey, if you want more, just press this button to pay $2 extra.
I know I'm at 2 terabytes. Am I going to be on this lifetime subscription to, and I know I am, so they win, right? But yeah, well, so then By the way, for the audience, hopefully now you see what I was talking about when Jessvin explained it. Now you understand it. These complex topics, right? They're understandable when you talk to Jessvin. So I appreciate that, Jessvin. But you actually did that on stage, right? Recently, you had a pitch that you actually won a competition. I think it was in Houston SEC Con, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you take us through that experience?
Houston SEC Con. It was really interesting and exciting. They have a Launchpad event where they try to bring together startups, have them pitch to real CISOs, and have those CISOs look at which one they think is the best to invest in. And honestly, I did it last minute. We were racing for a small company, led 10 people, just trying to do this and that. And we don't have a marketing department or any of those kinds of things. So I just did my own slides, and it was a big circle that said data. There's a lot of it. These arrows pointing outward that's saying it's going up. And ultimately, I can't find what I want. And then the idea of where is that causing problems? That's causing problems in cost. That's causing problems in human labor, engineering to manage it all. And it means there's missed visibility. When there's too much stuff, you can't see the stuff you want to look for. And ultimately, we built this capability with Auguria to help us find the things that are important and separate what's important from not, and to solve real world cases. And honestly, when I got in there, I'm like, I pitched it. It's a 3-minute pitch. You only have 3 minutes to pitch what you're doing. And then I think 2 minutes for questions. And I'm like, all right, I'm glad we did this. I'm glad we're here. I'm watching everybody else. They've got these awesome slides and everything. And they're doing agentic stuff and apps, this and that, all that kind of stuff. I'm like, all right, there's no way we're going to win. So I sat all the way when they finally announced the winners at the end of it. I sat all the way in the back. I was working on my laptop, and I figured I'll just hear what it is. I was going to be there for whatever. And then they announced that the winner is Auguria. I was literally shocked. I had no idea. Like, they're like looking around. Is there anyone here from there? And I'm like, come down like, way back in the nosebleed seats practically. And I'm like, I know I'm going to trip and fall going down there. But I thought what was interesting, talking to people afterwards, they're like, yeah, this is a real fundamental problem. These are fundamentals that in order to stay ahead, AI is just going to create more data. Everything's just going to go faster. So you've got to be able to manage that equivalently at the same scale it's increasing at is going to be an important problem to solve. And I think that's what Houston SEC Con and Launchpad was all about. Hey, regardless of whether something makes a ton of money, which is the same thing we were doing in Blackstone. Back then, at least Jay and I weren't like, yeah, we all want to make money, but we were not just looking at like, why did we invest in Carbon Black? We weren't thinking about exits. I didn't know anything about that. I was like, yeah, I've got this problem. I can't see what's going on the laptop. I can only see what's going on the network, and no one's using the network. They're all working from home or whatever. Back then it wasn't home, but it was all distributed. In the same way with Houston SEC Con, I think they were looking for what is solving challenges out there. And we were lucky enough to win that event.
Yeah, no, it's like the saying, beware of a solution in search of a problem. I feel like you can spend all your time sitting there building a product, but if it's not solving an actual user frustration or problem, and it sounds like you guys have that formula. So congrats on the win. That's awesome. What a cool story. One thing I like to ask all the guests on this podcast is advice for product marketers, builders, founders, anybody that's bringing these complex technologies to these chaotic markets that are on fire all the time, especially in cyber. Any advice? How do we best succeed at getting a message to a very busy audience? Do you have any kind of tips that you would offer up for us that are doing this craft?
Yeah, it's definitely a hard thing. And I think it's only gotten harder. That's for sure. There's so much noise everywhere. But we've always said, whether it's security or whether it's marketing, you got to work back from the customer. Always work back from the customer. So in security, I always tell my teams in MSSP, our number one goal is to protect the customer. All our other goals have to align to how is this helping protect the customer? Even if that means we're making the product cheaper or more capable or more affordable so they can afford it. We're removing a bell and whistle so they can afford it, because then they have better security protection or not. And that's the same thing I'd say in general is the most important thing is to find people that you can talk to and understand what their problems are. And a lot of times it takes 2 or 3 questions when you got to have the guts to do it. So in fact, one of our coworkers had this conversation recently with a prospect, and we had already had a couple of calls with them, and he had just joined as a solution engineer, and he was going to ask them, okay, what are your pain points? And I was like, okay, move on to the data, show them we did something, or they're going to be like, why are you wasting my time asking questions instead of telling me what I did? But I am so glad he asked those questions, because when he did, what we thought was the problem wasn't really the full problem. This happened to do with data analysis, and we thought data storage was the problem. And data storage wasn't the problem. They're like, it's all the data coming in that we got to process as it comes in. And nobody really had a problem with that. And maybe sometimes they will, but you got to keep looking to ask that question and get into the shoes of the customer. What's the job to be done? And even myself, I'm an engineer. I like to build things. I get more excited about building things, writing code, doing all of those kinds of things. But I try my best if I can. And even whether I'm using LinkedIn or talking on podcasts like this or going to events and just asking, like, what is your number of problem? What are the things you're working through? What does a day in the life look like to you? And I think it's easy to forget on the product side, like 60% of a person's day is meetings anyway. Then they have 40% to do their work. And out of the 40%, another 50% of that 40% is just figuring out what to do. And before it's squeezed all the way down to 5% of their time is solving a problem. So like if you could just increase that 5 to 10%, you solve that much, you've doubled their throughput and output. And if you're taking more time for them to figure out what you're doing, like you just slice their 5% down to 3%. You've cut it in half or 2.5 for half. But so I think just keeping that in mind is really important. And it's definitely not easy to do. But I say try to wake up every morning thinking that, like, how is it that I help the customer?
That's timeless advice because it reminds me of when I first started going to trade shows and doing demos for customers in person, right? It was daunting. I was terrified. I don't really know this technology that well. I don't know. What if they ask this or that? And one thing that I developed over 10 years of events now I always start with, so what are you looking at? Let me ask you about you. What's your role? I can't tell you how many times I've done a whole demo. And then at the end of it, they're like, sorry, I'm just like an exchange student. I was looking for some information or something, right? I'm like, oh, well, that was a great use of 15 minutes for, And so I always like, all right, so tell me about you. Like, what's your role? What's your company? Oh, what do you do? Are you in the SOC team here or this, that? Oh, like that first, it's like 1 minute or 45 seconds, exactly what you just said. For PMMs out there that feel this pressure to perform like you're some wizard of the product. And that's real, by the way. We feel we have to go like do this like song and dance in front of our products. But we always forget. It's like, it's not about you. It's not about your product. It's about that customer you're talking to, their problem. I love that advice. Any requests of the audience? Anything you want to ask for them to, I don't know, maybe take action of any kind? Check out Auguria, check you out on LinkedIn. Is there anything like that?
Definitely. We're an early stage startup. Check us out at auguria.io. We're actually pre-AI, so we have a .io, so AUGURIA.io. And I'm excited to hear from you for anything, actually. Anybody who's like looking for, if you find my advice useful or anything to do, I'd happy to do that. But anyone who also has the problem of data, like maybe they've got data sources they got to bring into their product that they just don't have the time to load. They don't know what security value in it or not. They try to figure out how to build detections that will tell them something useful about protecting their company, or maybe it's just saving cost. But either way, if you feel like you've got a data problem, whether you have a SIM, don't have a SIM, doesn't matter as much. We're here to help you and complement what you have to get more out of it.
Just SecOps data, though, not your phone data, right? Just want to clarify on that.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah.
That's for sure. It applies to many things, but yeah, we're focused on security and observability data for now.
Oh, and I'm going to steal I just saw a podcast and I'm going to steal this too at the end. He asked, if you could recommend anybody else to interview, who would it be?
Anybody else to interview, who would it be? I would interview Adam Kahn. So he worked for me at Scout Cybersecurity. He's at Barracuda and he runs a SOC there. And it's been interesting. He's got a combination of security expertise as well as just understanding customers and technology expertise. And I just think he's a fun, high energy guy.
All right. Adam, if you're hearing this, I'm coming after you. All right. Well, Jessvin, really appreciate the time. Hope we can do this again one day.
All right. Sounds great. Thanks a lot, Dane.
Well, that does it for this episode of the Cyber PMM podcast. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe, leave a comment or review, and let's connect on LinkedIn. Be sure to check out cyberpmm.com for more resources. And you can also subscribe to the Cyber PMM newsletter on Substack and LinkedIn to keep up to speed with everything you need to fight digital chaos, cut through the hype, and do more with less. See you next time.